since you all seem to have forgotten the equation for GDP, I think we'll start there as a refresher for you. Oops. Just as a tip going forward, there's going to be a significant number of equations this semester. So when this stuff presents itself, you might spend a bit of time in diligent study that evening, committing these things to memory because you're going to use them immediately. K. No, there's no K in this equation, Hope. All right, so we've got through consumption, correct? So our next letter is I for investment. An investment is not, I bought stock in the stock market kind of investment. Again, in our practice of using words differently in economics than you have used them in the rest of your life, investment here is investing in things that help you make things in the future. So primarily capital goods, property, etc. If you build a factory, that comes under I. Things that you have produced but haven't sold go into your inventory, and inventory is part of I as well. And to hammer home the point, pretty box. I want to point out there are some folks who are doing this electronically, and then Miranda has actually printed out the lecture notes, and she's doing far less writing than the rest of you. Question, Miranda?
If consumption is considered like households, like is that considered buying a house, or would investment be that because you're buying a structure?
Remember our discussion of you basically are paying yourself rent when you're buying a house, and that's part of consumption. It's part of the cost of living. Okay, going on to the government's role in GDP. Government purchases are just G for government. Everything the government purchases at any and all levels. So when the police department buys a new cruiser, when the state patrol buys a new cruiser, when the Army buys a new tank, when the Air Force buys a new drone, when the Navy builds a new aircraft carrier. Okay. Now, one part of what you think of as government spending isn't actually spending. When the government makes transfer payments, things like Medicare, Social Security, welfare, food stamp kinds of things, that is not part of G. That's just moving money from one place to another. Nothing's actually being purchased there. Now, when G gets spent by great-grandma to buy cat litter and depends, that is counted as what? It's part of C. Good. Okay. When the family goes to the grocery store and buys their milk, bread, and eggs for the week with their food stamps, that's counted as C. So if we were to count it here and counted under C, it would end up being double counting, and double counting is a no-no. It would artificially inflate our GDP figures. Okay, good here? Yes? I have to bring deadweight loss in to beat you guys up and wake you up. Net exports. NX stands for net exports. Net exports is a mini equation for exports minus imports. You would like for this to be a positive number, but at least for the past several years, decades, in the United States, this has been a negative number because our imports have exceeded our exports. When this is a negative number, what does it do to GDP? It reduces GDP. That's not what we want. So exports are how much we spend on, how much, not we spend, how much they, being the rest of the world, spends on our goods and services that we produce. And imports is how much we spend on what they produce. So if the government buys a missile system produced by the Israelis, a missile defense system produced by the Israelis, where does that fall? It's not under C, and it's not under G. It's an import. Doesn't matter who is buying it when it is foreign produced. Remember that last part of our definition of, or near the end of our definition of GDP? It's produced in a country within a given period of time. So if we're counting our GDP, it has to be produced in our country. So if we were to start purchasing Uzis, where are Uzis made? Huh? Israel. Those are going to count for imports. What if we buy AK-47s? Those are Russian and are thus an import. But if the Syrian rebels start purchasing Winchester rifles, yay, exports. Okay. So when we put it all together, here's where we end up. What do you suppose it's time to do now, boys and girls? Yay. In 2010, here's where we were at. $14 billion. So when I'm talking about imports actually cut down our GDP, per capita, we spent almost $1,800 on imported goods. Capita is the Latin word for head, so per person. Look at that government spending. $9,800 a person. That's a lot of money, especially when you're not considering transfer payments. That consumption figure is pretty big, isn't it? But remember, that's not all individual consumption. It's also firms. Most of it's from Starbucks. It's a lot of lattes. A lot of lattes. Okay. All right. I think we should apply more. You have to spend some time deciding where things count. How much is GDP and each of its components affected, if at all? You think consumption is affected by how much? $200. So what happens to GDP, up or down? Okay. All right. Sarah's bought a pretty nice laptop here. It's an import, okay, and so how is GDP affected? It's lowered by 1,800, all right. I'm hearing consumption, I'm also hearing not affected. Because it was manufactured last year, so it already counted for last year's GDP. So what component?
I don't really get what investment is.
Investment is if General Motors built a factory, or it's the cars that they build that go into their inventory.
Like, so it would be 470 in consumption and 30 in investment.
Ah, here, Matthias.
Because there's 30 million that's like left over that they still have.
$30 million worth of investment and $470 million worth of consumption is what Matthias says. What's your question, Aaron?
So what would like C be if it was like this year?
If it was a computer manufactured this year, it would be consumption of $1,200. Good morning, Dr. O'Hanlon. He's out ill today. It says medical.
How's it going in here, Macro? Loving it?
We're struggling with the components of GDP this morning.
Oh, I struggled with econ big time. I'm not a business teacher.
It's okay, I struggled with calc.
Yeah, that was no fun either. But I made it through.
All right, so let's go through and see what the actual answers are now that you've made your predictions. Yay, you were right. There's not much rejoicing.
What's that from?
Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And there was much rejoicing. Yay. You got half of this one right. Because she's using it in her publishing business, and so it's a good purchased to use to make other things.
So it's like a, what was that called?
It's a capital good.
Didn't we call them like input or no? Never mind.
Intermediate goods? No. No. If she bought the components and built the computer herself, they would be intermediate goods, but it would still be an investment overall. How is it not double counting?
So it just pretty much zeroes out
Because it matters whether it was made here or not. So if it was made here, it would have just been investment rises by 1,800. But because it was foreign made, we have to count the fact that the money left the country. So it's a zero net effect.
So if the import was like for a good use like that, then it would just zero out.
Yeah.
What's an example where like
If the computer was made in California, then you wouldn't have to deduct the net export. If it wasn't an investment, if it was, well, almost all imports are going to work this way. I mean, if it's imported, it's getting used in some way. The government's buying it, or it's getting consumed, or it's investment.
Wait, so even if it's being just consumed, like if it's like food.
Or clothes. Yeah, it still zeroes out because it's still consumption. Ultimately, the fact is it doesn't help GDP when it's imported goods. So, remind me, what'd you say for this one? Boom, nailed it. And what was Matthias's clever solution here? 470 for consumption, 30 for investment. What's the overall impact on GDP?
Hey, Mattia, I see you.
Nice work, nice work. All right. There are some end of chapter problems that work along these lines. Perhaps you should take a look at those this evening, and then you can ask any questions you have about them tomorrow. Okay, real versus nominal GDP. Remember, real is relative and nominal is now. Nominal is at this instant. Real being relative has to be a comparison to some other time. Okay? So nominal GDP is a measure of GDP at this point in time. Relative or real GDP is a comparison. Is our GDP higher or lower than whenever you choose to compare it to? Okay. It is because of inflation that we have to look at these two types of GDP. If we only ever look at nominal GDP, we're going to think that our GDP is always doing what? We're always going to think it's going up because inflation almost always exists. There are some concerns right now internationally that there may be some deflationary influences going on in Europe right now, especially with the decrease in gas prices, and they're really concerned that the Eurozone's going to drop back into recession. Spain, in particular, is always kind of one of those troubled economies, one of the pigs countries, as they call them. Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. They only had 0.1% GDP growth last quarter. That's almost stagnant and darn near negative growth, and negative growth is going to drop you into deflation. And so then you really need to be looking at relative GDP or real GDP rather than nominal. All right, nominal GDP is the value of our output using current prices. Because it's using current prices, it is not inflation corrected. Nominal GDP is, ladies and gentlemen, virtually useless to an economist. Well, it's a meaningless number because it is not comparable to anything. If David were to come in and go, oh my gosh, I weighed 202 pounds this morning. Great. How tall are you? What did you weigh on this date last year? What height were you then? If he comes in and says, when I was 7, I weighed 85. Okay, what do most 7-year-olds of your height at that time weigh? It's a meaningless number. You have to have some ability to compare, which is why real GDP is so much more important and interesting to us. It values the output using prices of whatever base year you're going to compare to. And thus is corrected for inflation. Are you understanding the concept at this point? Because oftentimes adding the numbers can make for confusion. I'm going to hope that doesn't happen. Here we go. Could you compute nominal GDP for each year? Nominal means now. So you would take the quantity times the price for each year and add the total expenditure on pizza to the total expenditure on latte, correct? You should do that. So how much did we spend on pizza in 2011? 4,000. How much should we spend on lattes? What is our total GDP in 2011? If you say so. Repeat. It's harder to do that one in your head, isn't it? We'll make it 1,000, and then
2750. So 8250.
Ooh, boy.
boom, Matthias to the rescue again. Okay. So here's a question for you. Did GDP increase each year? Nominal GDP increased each year. In fact, from 2011 to 2012, it increased by 37.5%. Was the increase as large from 2012 to 2013? Boom, it was 30.9%.
I have the answers right here.
You stink.
You can say that, you just don't admit that you have the answers.
All right. Does that mean anything?
No.
Now, I want to clue you into something. You can make some conclusions about whether or not real GDP increased without actually calculating at this point. You can guess. And here's how you do it. Take 2011 as your base year, and you've got that price. If your quantity increased, then the odds are your GDP increased. Because even if you're still multiplying by that base number, your GDP will have gone up. In fact, do that.
What if your like after your base and your prices went down but quantity still increased? Would that mean anything?
It would. We'll talk about that. So what's your GDP in 2011? Still. It's much easier to do these now in your head. What is it in 2012? What?
72.
Is there anyone who is confused as to how we got to those numbers? Okay. So what's our percentage increase from 11 to 12? Cheater. 20%. How do you calculate that percentage increase? You take the difference between 7,200 and 6,000 and divide it by what? Divided by what?
Or you could just make it equal to x over 100 and that's why 6.
Definitely take the zeros off. Say what?
You could do 6 over 72 equals x over 100. Take 6 times 100 divided.
That's how I would do it. So when nominal GDP increased but increased by less, that was still for us an indication of what real GDP was going to do, wasn't it? So here's a question for you. The quantities increased by the same amounts each year, correct? We sold 100 more of both pizza and latte in each year. So why did our GDP increase less the second year? No, we've taken inflation out of it when we calculated real GDP. We used the base price. Yeah, this is why you guys can't figure out why you can't raise your grade towards the end of the semester. You're dividing by a bigger number, so it would have to increase even more to maintain the same percentage growth. Okay, the answer is because math. Okay, so in each year, nominal GDP is measured using that current year's prices, and real GDP is measured using the base year prices, and we had chosen 2011. The change in nominal GDP shows you a change in both quantities and prices, whereas the change in real GDP shows you just the change in quantities. Okay. Zero inflation is what you're working at when you deal with real GDP, because you're not allowing the price to change.
So you want 0 for real GDP percent?
No, you don't want zero.
You said 0 for.
I said zero inflation is what you're working at.
Percentage to change.
No, you do want the percentage to change, but you only want it to change based on change in quantity, not change in price. If you allow the price to change, then you're allowing inflation to skew your data.
You don't want to produce less and charge more.
David.
How do they actually choose their base year? Is there a
It's based on what you want to compare to. Like if we're calculating GDP now, do we want to compare back to the recession years where we know things were worse and our GDP is gonna be higher? Or do we want to go pre-recession and see if we are ahead of where we were 10 years ago?
So it's all relative.
Yeah, it all depends on what question you're asking. The old saying goes, figures lie and liars figure. Basically what we're saying here is real GDP is corrected for inflation. We take price increases out of the equation completely. Miranda, you still confused? Okay. Here's what it looks like graphically. Look, where the recession started. Hiccup? Now we have a problem. Or do we? Why did the lines cross?
That's bad because the prices in 05 were higher than they were in 1970.
Why is nominal higher than real at the end of this graph?
Because math.
Higher inflation so you take that under real and so you don't have
You guys are missing the really obvious. Look at the graph.
Oh, the base year's 2005.
Yeah, in the base year, shouldn't nominal and real be the same? They have to cross. Wherever you put the base year, they're gonna be the same. Wherever you put the base year, they're gonna be the same. And then anything after that, nominal will be higher because it's taking into account inflation. Okay. Sometimes you smart kids really miss the obvious. It wasn't even reading the graph, it was reading the label.
Words.
I thought
Words.
the line was pointing to where 2005 was, like I wasn't looking at the bottom.
Oh. So before you start to answer graphically based questions on the exam, examine the graph and make sure you're reading what you think you're reading. Some of you have had some problems with that in the past. Okay? Be clear about what you're looking at. Okay. Here's a question for you. Look at the rate of inflation after 1980. And how can I guess about the rate of inflation? Nominal GDP's slope changes significantly there, doesn't it? And real GDP's dancing around a little bit, but its slope is fairly constant, isn't it? Till we get to that recession. That's a pretty big hit. We bounce back. Though, how much did we bounce back? Because look at that figure right at the edge of the graph. Is it that much higher than pre-recession? But the corresponding difference between nominal GDP at the edge of the graph and pre-recession? Much higher.
So like what happened before the recession?
Lots of things. 2001, the terrorist attacks really hit our economy. People kind of began doing what's called cocooning. It's a psychological sort of thing. They started staying home and hiding out. Travel really took a hit, and travel is a huge consumption generator in our country. Corporations quit having people travel for business, and telecommuting became a thing, and so there was a lot of constriction in the economy there. Whenever there's a constriction in the economy, people start losing jobs. As people started losing jobs, and we had the fear of terrorism in, people stopped spending, and so things just got worse and worse and worse until things turned around and we began to bottom out and come out of it. Tax cuts and stimulus spending helped to bring that out a lot as well, and that increased governmental spending is part of what contributed to that higher inflation rate that you see at the end there as well. Question, Anna?
Was there deflation during the Great Depression?
Yes, there was tremendous deflation during the Great Depression.
Does that mean, did everybody's money become worth less, like around the world?
Yes, very much so. Not quite to the point where it was in Germany under the Weimar Republic when the Deutschmarks were not worth the money they were printed on. But yeah, everybody suffered deflation during the Depression. Okay. And then right here, what you're looking at, this little blip right there, is what's known as the Reagan recession, which is almost directly a result of the oil crisis and some of the Carter economic decisions that went on. Okay, more equations. GDP deflator is a measure of overall price level. Okay. It's a very simple equation, and it's a very important number that you arrive at. You take nominal GDP over real GDP, multiply by 100. And so we use this to figure out our inflation rate. You figure out the GDP deflator in year 1, figure it out in year 2, figure out the percentage change, and that is the inflation rate. It's actually pretty cool. Truly. Yes. Guess what GDP deflator in year 1 will always be? Well, in the base year, what are nominal and real GDP? They're always the same. So what's GDP deflator in the base year? 100. Guys are so smart.
Do you use the nominal and real for the same year?
No. Does that make sense? For the actual calculating of the deflator for that year, yes, you do. You use the same to calculate that year's deflator. So what's the deflator in 2012? What's the equation? So nominal over real. Okay. Always just go to the tenths. Okay. And then for 2013, repeat. Now to calculate inflation rate, what do we do? In what?
Between the inflation.
Yeah, so if you want the inflation rate from 2011 to 2012, you're going to calculate the percentage change between 100 and 114.6. If you want the inflation rate from 12 to 13, you calculate the percentage change here. If you want the inflation rate from 11 to 13, you calculate the percentage change there. Make sense? So you calculate the GDP deflator for each year independently, and then compare whatever year to whatever year you want. Did you see that one coming? Think it's the same, higher, or lower from 12 to 13? Lower, because math. Okay? Understand this. So what's the change? What's the numerical change between 100 and 114.6? 14.6. Divide it by the original number. There you go. So the change here is 14 divided by the original number. You get 12. Okay? Are we good here? This is a good stopping point. We're going to start with some application tomorrow after we do our current events quiz.
Do you have a current event due tomorrow too?
Yes, you have a current event due tomorrow. You gonna email it to me?
That's fine.
Okay.